Section 26 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 5, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mary, Chapter 6, Part 3. King Philip returned for a short time in March, 1557, for the purpose of forcing his queen into a war with France. It is certain she had received every provocation from Henry II, who had incited all the plots that had agitated England since her accession, yet she was very loath to involve her kingdom in the expenses of a war, which her finances were totally inadequate to support. She, however, took the opportunity of pardoning most of the rebels that had been engaged in the late insurrection, on condition of their joining the English quota of Philip's army, then mustering near Calais. Lord Bray was among the number, which likewise comprised the surviving sons of the Duke of Northumberland, the Queen having restored their property as well as their freedom. She raised money to equip her army by borrowing from the country gentlemen and citizens, who had capital to spare, small sums at the enormous interest of 12%. Philip left England in the summer, and the Queen never saw him more. His friend, the Prince of Savoy, won for him the Battle of St. Quentin in August, but this victory seemed an illustration of the Irish adage of "gaining a loss," since the principal result was, that the French got possession of Calais a few months afterwards. The recent visit of Philip and the martial excitement around her had roused Queen Mary for a short time from the deadly torpor of disease, and she became sufficiently convalescent to be occupied with a series of vexations. Not the least of these was the pertinacity with which Philip II insisted on forcing her sister Elisabeth to give her hand to his friend, the Prince of Savoy, who was at this time the hero of the day. It must be owned that if Mary wished to disinherit or banish her sister, it was strange that she encouraged her in her objections to every foreign match. When Philip urged arguments in behalf of his friend, Queen Mary answered, that she had consented to the match while she thought Elisabeth would approve of it, but that, as she found her exceedingly averse, in consequence she could not force her into an unwilling marriage. The queen added, that she was certain that Parliament would not suffer her sister to quit the kingdom, a clear acknowledgment of Elizabeth's position, as second person in the realm. This controversy produced an angry letter from Philip, in which he charged Mary, on her conscience, and as she regarded the future welfare of her religion, to bring this matter to bear. This produced a singular letter from Queen Mary, written in French. It is worded in the self-denying and humble style conventional in epistles of the era, but contains a distinct avowal of determination to act, in regard to her sister's marriage, only as her Parliament should agree. A principle which governed her in every act of her regal life, although she has been made singly responsible for all the evil enacted by her parliaments, as if she had been an autocrat who issued ukases expressive of her sole will. Queen Mary to King Philip. Monsieur, I have received the letters from your highness, by Francisco, the 18th instant, humbly thanking you for the same, especially as you are pleased to write that you took mine in good part, which were, indeed, I assure your highness, written with good intention, and assuredly, seeing that yours was written with the same, I can say nothing more than to entreat your highness, seeing that you think it right that I examine my conscience to discover whether it is founded in truth or not, to name what persons your highness may think most proper to communicate with me on this affair, and I will willingly listen to them sincerely, whomsoever they may be. Nevertheless, in my last letter to your highness, I made an offer to agree to this marriage on this occasion, provided I have the consent of this realm, and so I will. But without this consent, I fear that neither your highness nor this realm will be well served on this occasion, for your highness will remember that once I procured of myself an opportunity of listening to the friars of your highness, but they then and Alfonso propounded questions so obscure or irrelevant, that, to my simple understanding, there was no comprehending them. As, for instance, who was king in Adam's days? and said withal that I was bound to conclude this marriage by an article in my creed. Yet if he had not propounded things too difficult to be understood, it was nevertheless impossible for him, in so short a time, to direct my conscience. But one thing I promise your highness, whomsoever you appoint will not find me obstinate, or without reason, I hope. Meantime your highness has written, in the said letters, that, if a parliament shall go contrary, your highness will impute the fault to me. I beg, in all humility, that your highness will defer this matter till your return, and then it will be manifest whether I am culpable or not. Otherwise I shall live in apprehension of your highness's displeasure, which would be worse to me than death, for I have already begun to taste too much, to my regret. Truth to say, in my simple judgment, under the correction of your highness, and seeing that the Duke of Savoy will be at this hour entered on the campaign, unless a number of the council, the nobility, and kingdom are with your highness, I cannot find by what means the matter can be properly treated, nor how, in my judgment, even if my conscience were as completely satisfied as yours is, this matter can be brought to the end which your highness desires, without your presence. Wherefore, monsieur, in as humble wise as it is possible for me, being your very loyal and very obedient wife, which to be I confess myself justly obliged to be, and in my opinion more than any other woman, having such a husband as your highness is, without speaking of the multitude of your kingdoms, for that is not my principal motive, I entreat your highness that we both pray to God, and put our first confidence in him, that we may meet and live together. And that same God, in whose hand is the direction of the hearts of kings, will, I hope, without fail, enlighten us in such manner, that all at last shall tend to his glory and your satisfaction. It is very plainly to be gathered from this letter that Mary did not choose to use any indirect and illegal methods of influencing her parliament in favour of a marriage which was equally against the wishes of her sister and the kingdom. This letter has been mentioned, but surely by persons incapable of reading the original, as an instance of the utter slavery of Mary's disposition, when, in truth, she makes in it a proper distinction between the tenderness of a wife and the duties of an English queen. She will discuss the marriage with whomsoever her husband appoints, but she will not be influenced to act against her regal integrity, either by the mysticism or the bigotry of his friars. She means to leave the whole to her parliament, but deprecates his unreasonable displeasure in making her accountable, when she has no right to control their acts. She shows that nothing but trouble will follow any exertion of despotism in the affair. Yet, if her husband wishes to influence her people, he had better do it in person, for she wants much to see him. And she concludes with a prayer, almost in the words retained in our liturgy, that God, in whose hand are the hearts of kings, will direct this matter to his glory. And, when it is considered that the matter was providing Elisabeth with a Catholic spouse, the whole tends to clear Mary's character of some stains of bigotry. The ambassador to whom Philip confided the negotiation of this marriage was his beautiful and fascinating cousin, Christina of Denmark. Like all the female descendants of Isabel of Castile, this young lady possessed great talents for government. She was daughter of the deposed tyrant, Christiern II, King of Denmark, and the virtuous Isabel, sister of the Emperor Charles V. Early inured to misfortune, Christina was reared in exile and became the ornament and darling of the imperial court. She married the Duke of Lorraine, and was at this time a widow. Philip II was suspected of cherishing a passion for his lovely cousin, who had great influence in his councils. Christina was an active politician, but, to her credit be it spoken, she had an enthusiastic turn for negotiating peace. Some rumours of Philip's partiality for his cousin had reached the ears of Mary, who, either displeased with the embassy, or jealous of the ambassadress, gave her, though a near kinswoman of her own, anything but a gracious reception. She warned Elisabeth that if she did not wish to marry Savoy, she must keep close to Hatfield. Thus, Christina never saw her. After the departure of the lovely diplomatiste, it is said, Queen Mary, in an excess of jealousy, cut her husband's picture to pieces with her own hand. She had recently received a portrait of him, to which a curious anecdote is annexed. She had no great idea of the valor of her spouse, but when she was told that for the first time in his life he had appeared in armor at the siege of St. Quentin, she was smitten with an extreme desire to have his picture, representing him in his warlike panoply. Philip very gallantly complied with her wish, and sent her his portrait, in armor all but the helmet, for he did not consider it was consistent with etiquette that the head should be covered before the queen. Perhaps this was the picture on which she wreaked her vengeance. Mary was exasperated at the thought that her husband had deserted her, and given to his cousin the confidence and influence she ought to have possessed. Her health again received a mortal shock from the attacks of chronic disease, but, like a self-deception like monomania, she once more fancied that she was about to become a mother. She made her will in the autumn of 1557, under this impression. In many clauses she alluded to a hope of offspring, as futile as that she had formerly cherished. Michel, the Venetian ambassador, who saw Queen Mary at the close of the year 1557, will not allow that she was otherwise than an interesting looking woman. He thus minutely describes her person. She is of low stature, but has no deformity in any part of her person. She is thin and delicate, altogether unlike her father, who was tall and strongly made, or her mother, who, if not tall, was massive. Her face is well formed, and her features prove, as well as her pictures, that when younger she was not only good looking, but more than moderately handsome. She would now be so, saving some wrinkles, caused more by sorrow than age. She looks years older than she is, and always appears very grave. Her eyes are piercing, and inspire not only deference, but even fear in those on whom she bends them. Yet she is nearsighted, being unable to read or do anything else without her eyes being close to whatever she would peruse or well discern. Her voice powerful, and high-pitched, like that of a man, so that when she speaks she is heard at some little distance. This is a peculiarity often observed in females who sing well, for a very fine voice in singing is often counterbalanced by most unpleasant tones in speech. In short, resumes Michel, she may, at her present age, be considered very good looking, not only as a queen, but a woman, and ought never to be despised for ugliness. Such is the opinion of a contemporary ambassador, whose national interest by no means led him to be her adulator, rather the contrary. The real portraits of Mary are as much historical mysteries as her private character and conduct. Her portraits, as a girl and young woman, vary much from each other, on account of the extreme fluctuations of her health. Her early portraits are often mistaken for those of Lady Jane Grey, to whom she bore, in youth, a strong family resemblance. The immense size of the foreheads of these kinswomen, in breadth as well as in height, is extraordinary. It is possible that the early erudition of both, and their great capacity for learning, is, in some degree, connected with this mighty development of frontal brain. The enormous breadth of music in Mary's forehead is well accounted for, by her early proficiency in that science. Perhaps the musical development in Queen Mary's forehead is the largest that can be instanced in any female head. Her passion for music must have amounted to mania. The youthful portraits of Mary fully justify the continual praises we have been forced to quote, from contemporary documents, of the attractiveness of her person. The portrait, preferred by Sir Frederick Madden, is at Burleigh House. She has brown hair, large open dark eyes, full red lips, and a good complexion. In the possession of E. Wenman Martin, Esquire, is a fine portrait by Holbein, representing Mary as a girl of 16. She is pretty, excepting a slight degree of pettishness about the full red lips. This expression is mentioned by Sir Frederick Madden, as pertaining to another pretty girlish portrait, engraven by Hollar, from the Arundel collection. In the Holbein family group, at Hampton Court, she is a pleasing woman of 28. Indeed, till after her marriage, all portraiture represents her as a pleasing woman. Virtue's picture, lately at Strawberry Hill, gives her a pretty face, exceedingly resembling the portrait in possession of Mr. E. Wenman Martin; but, in some of the engravings from the celebrated Burleigh picture, her face is what the Americans would call awful, not in majesty, but in ugliness. She is, in an original picture, from which the Granger Society have engraved, seated in state under a canopy, dressed with royal magnificence in a gold cloth brocaded kirtle, hanging rebra sleeves, and a jewelled hood. Her husband, who is a young man of mean presence and carroty complexion, stands near her canopy. Two little fair hounds are at her feet. The room in which the royal pair are represented is some state chamber at Whitehall, which commanded a view of old St. Paul's, for that cathedral is seen through an open window. The date is 1558, and it must have been painted during Philip's last visit to England, when the effects of dire disease were painfully apparent in the queen's visage. A woman's portrait ought to be taken for futurity in the prime of life. It would be hard, even upon Helen of Troy, to form our ideas of beauty, when shaken by decay and verging to the tomb. A series of the most dismal, wet, and cold seasons, such as have been observed to occur in many instances in the middle of centuries, plagued the reign of Mary. Famines and burning fevers succeeded this atmospheric irregularity, and were regarded by many as judgments, inflicted by God, for the tortures of the Protestants, without considering that the insalubrity of the seasons were alike inimical to the health and comfort of the professors of each faith. But gloom and superstitious excitement pervaded the whole population of England, in the middle of the 16th century, and every aberration from the common course of nature was viewed through their medium. Phosphoric exhalations of a luminous appearance have been much seen, even on high grounds, after the wet and unhealthy autumn of 1841, and these have been viewed with some awe by the simple country people in these enlightened days. But these same phenomena were observed at the latter end of the reign of Mary, and were fully believed to be the spectra of those horrid fires which had consumed the Protestant martyrs. These phosphoric meteors certainly boded no good to human health, for general pestilence succeeded them. Strype's chronicler thus mentions these appearances. Apparitions of strange fires were seen by persons, in many places in the neighbourhood of London, as in Finsbury Fields, Moorfield, near the windmill, and at the dog house, by one Dame Annis Clears, and in many open places. The natural result of hostilities with France was war with Scotland, which was then united under one royal family. The Scotch having made a desperate inbreak over the English border, Queen Mary took the resolution of heading an army against them, and she summoned the northern militia, by a proclamation to that effect. She had sufficient energy of mind for such an exploit, had her sinking frame seconded her intentions. The unexpected loss of Calais, with which the year commenced, overwhelmed both the English and their queen with dismay, and, during the remainder of her miserable life, she was harassed with schemes to regain that fragment of France, the sole fruits of all the conquests of the Plantagenets. This town was maintained, by the sovereigns of England, at an expense equal to a fifth of the revenue. It had often been the nursery of faction, and several revolts, which shook the English throne, had been concocted within its walls, yet it was dearly prized by the English, as the key to France, whenever they should possess a monarch sufficiently combative to renew the invasions of Edward III. And Henry V., a consummation the nation devoutly wished, not having sufficient statistic wisdom to trace the long miseries of civil strife in the 15th century, to the evil qualities induced in the population by such diabolical warfare, from which they gained nothing but the expensive possession of Calais. It is little known, that this town sent 2 representatives to the English House of Commons. The Duke of Guise captured the citadel of Homs by a coup de main in the first days of January, and, before the end of the month, Calais itself was reunited to the French crown. "When do you English intend to visit France again?" was the taunting question asked by a French chevalier of an English veteran, as Lord Grey was marching out of Calais. "When your national crimes exceed ours, was the admirable reply, and this prediction, recorded by the historic pen of Lord Bacon, has been fulfilled by the Duke of Wellington. But neither Mary nor her subjects could foresee a futurity so consolatory to national pride. The English insisted that King Philip should make no peace with France till Calais was restored, and this involved the queen in such a mesh of disputes that she declared, she should die, and if her breast was open, Calais would be found written on her heart. Her death was near at hand. She had resided at Richmond in the spring, where she had a bad, intermittent fever, induced by the series of wet, ungenial seasons, prevalent throughout her reign. Before the Jesuits discovered the specific of Peruvian bark, agues and other intermittents were the scourge of the country, and often degenerated into the worst typhus fevers. So little was understood of the nature of malaria, that the queen removed to Hampton Court for change of air, which is situated nearer the level of the Thames than was Richmond Palace. Finding she grew worse, she removed from thence to St. James's, which has the most marshy site that London could offer. Here, however, the fever somewhat abated, but her spirits were oppressed with extreme melancholy, at the tidings of the death of her kinsman Charles V., which occurred in September 1558. While the queen lay very sick and ill, persons were punished with the pillory, for falsely reporting that she had expired. It is evident her unfortunate subjects were treated with increased cruelty by the council, who directed the religious persecution which raged in the land. A poor woman, named Alice Driver, was burnt to death for heresy. She had a short time previously been condemned, by Sir Clement Hyman, a judge more clement in name than nature, to have her ears cut off, for railing on her majesty and calling her Jezebel. There is a strong contrast between these horrid sentences and that inflicted on an expert scold, at Bedford, who, for the same offence, was, when Mary presided over her council, condemned, for railing against her majesty, to the ancient constitutional punishment of the cucking stool. King Philip did not visit England, but sent the Count de Feria with a message and ring to his dying wife. Feria was likewise empowered to confer with the English Parliament. The dispatches of this ambassador contain some curious particulars. He found Parliament very uneasy at the loss of Calais, extremely averse to imposing heavy taxes, for the purpose of regaining it, and, above all things, unwilling to break the alliance with Flanders, which, it was affirmed, was indispensable, since the union of France and Scotland. King Philip advised Queen Mary to take some steps for the proper recognition of Elisabeth as her successor. A proposition which Mary, says Feria, greeted with great satisfaction. The queen likewise sent her jewels to her sister by the Countess de Feria, formerly Jane Dormer. To these, by King Philip's orders, was added a very precious casket of gems he had left at St. James's Palace, which he knew Elisabeth particularly admired. The queen, when she sent the jewels, charged her sister to pay all the debts she had contracted on privy seals, and to keep religion as she found it, both which injunctions the Countess de Feria affirmed Elisabeth swore to regard. Thus it is evident that Mary was on good terms with her sister when she lay on her deathbed. Cardinal Pole was dying of the same intermittent fever as his royal cousin. It was doubtful which would expire first, and messages hourly passed between these early friends. The whole court had deserted Mary's palace, since her recognition of Elisabeth as her successor, and were seen passing and repassing on the road to Hatfield. Of this desertion the queen never complained. Perhaps she thought it natural, and she had devoted friends round her, who paid her requisite attention, but Elisabeth often recalled it with horror, when pressed to name a successor. The hand of death was on the queen throughout the 16th of November, but her previous sufferings had blunted the usual agonies of disillusion, for she was composed and even cheerful. Between 4 and 5 in the morning of November 17th, after receiving extreme unction, at her desire, mass was celebrated in her chamber. At the elevation of the host, she raised her eyes to heaven, and at the benediction bowed her head, and expired. These particulars of the last moments of Queen Mary were given by an eye-witness, white, Bishop of Winchester, in her funeral sermon. Cardinal Pole survived her. Being informed of her departure, he expressed the greatest satisfaction at the prospect of his speedy dissolution, which actually took place within 2 days. The deceased queen was embalmed, and then removed, from the chamber in which she expired, into the chapel of St. James's Palace, on the evening of the 10th of December, where she laid in state, with the usual watch of ladies. It was the custom of the body of an English sovereign to be buried in royal array, but Mary had earnestly entreated that no semblance of the crown, which had pressed so heavily on her brow in life, might encumber her corpse in death. She requested that she might be interred in the habit of a poor religious. Leti is the only historian who records this request, but it is more probable that Mary made it than it was fulfilled. Her funeral took place on the 13th of the same month, and it proves how completely the Gothic etiquette, followed at such ceremonials, recognized alone the warlike and masculine character in a sovereign. For our first queen regnant's helmet, sword, targe, and body armour were carried before her corpse, and a stranger in the country, trusting only the eye, would have supposed the English were attending the burial of a king. The procession set out from the palace of St. James, where she died. A herald, who was an eyewitness of the scene, thus describes it. So up the highway went the foremost standard, the falcon and the hart. Then came a great company of mourners. Then another goodly standard of the lion and the falcon, followed by King Philip's servants, riding 2 and 2. Then the third standard, with the white greyhound and falcon. The Marquess of Winchester bore the banner of England on horseback. Chester herald, the helm, the crest, and the mantle. Norrie the target, with the crown of England and the order of the Garter. Clarencieux the sword, and Mr. Garter king at arms, her coat armour, all on horseback. The Somerset, Lancaster, Windsor, and York heralds carried 4 white banners of saints embossed in fine gold. Then came the corpse in a chariot, with an exact image representing Queen Mary, dressed in crimson velvet, with many gold rings on the hands. The pall over the coffin was black cloth of gold, intersected by a cross of cloth of silver. The body was followed by the chief mourners. The queen's ladies came after on horseback, but their black trains were long enough to sweep after them on the ground. Before the corpse, and following after, came processions of monks, mourning their own fate as well as the death of Mary. Such was the procession which passed by Charing Cross, and arrived at the great door of Westminster Abbey, where every one alighted from their horses. There waited gentlemen, ready to take the queen out of her chariot. The earls and lords went before her, towards the hearse, which, it must always be remembered, was erected in the abbey, near or over the grave. The effigy above mentioned was carried between men of worship. At the great door of the abbey, 4 bishops and Abbot Feckenham, in pontificalibus, met this procession and censed the corpse. The royal corpse was placed on the hearse, and watched the livelong night on December 13th. The 100 poor men, in good black gowns and hoods, bearing long torches with the queen's guard, in black coats, bearing staff torches, stood round the hearse that night, and wax chandlers were in attendance to supply any torches that burnt out. The next morning, December 14th, was the queen's mass, and all the mourners offered. And the queen's body armour, her sword, her helmet, her target, her banner of arms, and 3 standards were all offered, her heralds standing round her coffin. The Bishop of Winchester preached a most remarkable funeral sermon for the deceased queen, being often interrupted by his tears. The historical circumstances attending this oration prove that Queen Elizabeth was present at the ceremony. The herald, who is our guide for this curious ceremonial, proceeds to say: Then her grace was carried up to that chapel King Henry VII built, attended by mitred bishops. When the heralds brake their staffs, and flung them into her grave, all the people plucked down the hangings and the armorial bearings round about the abbey, and every one tore him a piece as large as he could catch it. What a scene of uproar and confusion must have concluded the last state funeral rites of the Roman Catholic Church in England! However, the Bishop of York, in the midst of the hurly-burly, proclaimed a collation, and as soon as he finished, The bishops, Abbot Feckenham, the lords, ladies, and knights, went into the abbey to dinner. Mary was interred on the north side of Henry VII's chapel. No memorial exists of her, saving her participation in the following inscription, inscribed on two small black tablets, erected by the order of James I, which point out the spots where her body reposes with that of her sister, Queen Elizabeth. Regno consortis et urnam, hic abdormimus Elisabetta et Maria, sores, in spe resurrectionis. Elizabeth dispatched Lord Cobham on the 23rd of November to Philip II, who was then in Flanders, with the news of her sister's demise. Mary's widower celebrated her requiem in the Cathedral of Brussels simultaneously with her burial, and on the same day, by a singular coincidence, the like service was performed for his father Charles V, and for his aunt, the Queen of Hungary, so busy had death been in the royal family of Spain. In her testament, Mary styled herself Queen of England, Spain, France, both Sicilies, Jerusalem, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, Archduchess of Austria, Duchess of Burgundy, Milan, and Brabant, Countess of Habsburg, Flanders, and Tyrol. She named her husband as principal executor, and her cousin, Cardinal Pole, as the acting executor, to whom she left £1,000. She considered that she had a right to dispose of, by will, the church property she found still unalienated by her father and brother. The income arising from it she seems to have devoted to the maintenance of the most miserable of the poor, with which the country abounded, and the capital, which she might have granted to hungry courtiers during her lifetime, she was exceedingly anxious should return to purposes of charity. And she seemed to think that, as she had not dissipated it in life, she had a right to direct its destination after death, a point that would admit some controversy. The principal use to which she devoted this fund was so noble, that it seems grievous her will remained altogether a dead letter. And forasmuch, she says, as there is no house or hospital specially ordained and provided for the relief and help of poor and old soldiers, namely, of such as have been hurt or maimed in the wars and service of this realm, to which we think both honor, conscience, and charity willeth should be provided. And therefore my mind and will is, that my executors shall, as shortly as they may, after my decease, provide some convenient house, within or nigh the suburbs of the city of London, the which house I would have founded and created, being governed with one master and two brethren. And I will that this hospital be endowed with manors, lands, and possessions, to the value of 400 marks yearly. She recommended that good rules and ordinances should be made for the hospital by her executors, and specially I would have them respect the relief, succor, and help of poor, impotent, and aged soldiers, chiefly those that be fallen into extreme poverty and have no pension or other living. She devotes her jewels and every kind of property to the payment of her debts by privy seal, and the debts of her father and brother, which seem to have hung very heavily on her mind. She devotes about £2,000 in all to the refoundation of the convents of Sion, Sheen, and the Observance, for works of charity and relief of the poor, and the support of the Savoy Hospital. There is not a penny bestowed on any devotional observance unconnected with active charity. Neither image, lamp, nor pilgrimage are mentioned, and here the will is in coincidence with her privy purse expenses. One passage in it is extremely interesting, which is her desire to be united in death with her dearly beloved and virtuous mother, Queen Catharine. And further I will, she says, that the body of my most dear and well-beloved mother, of happy memory, Queen Catharine, which lieth now buried at Peterborough, shall, within as short a time as conveniently it may after my burial, be removed, brought, and laid nigh the place of my sepulture. In which place I will my executors cause to be made honorable tombs, for a decent memory of us. This, it is scarcely needful to say, was never done, and both mother and daughter repose without such honorable tombs. When, however, the Catholic altars in Westminster Abbey, that in Henry VII's chapel, and the high altar, were torn down in the reign of Elizabeth, The consecrated stones were carried and laid on Queen Mary's grave. Queen Mary left to Philip, to keep for a memory of her, one jewel, being a table diamond, which the Emperor's Majesty, his and my most honourable father, sent unto me, by Count de Egmont, at the insurance or betrothal of my said lord and husband. Also one other table diamond, which his Majesty sent unto me, by the Marquis de los Naves, and the collar of gold set with 9 diamonds, which his Majesty gave me the Epiphany after our marriage. Also the ruby, now set in a gold ring, which his Highness sent me, by the Count de Feria. She very anxiously provided in her will for her state debts, raised for the support of the war, on her privy seals, bearing the enormous interest of from 12 to 20 per cent. These would have been blended with the national debt in modern times, but Mary, like other sovereigns of her era, treated them wholly as her personal obligations, and, at the same time, considered the goods of the state as her private property, for she pointed out in her will, that she left ships, arms, and crown jewels, far beyond the value of these debts, on which she clearly implied that the state creditors had just claim, an extraordinary feature in the history of finance, and perhaps not wholly undeserving the attention of our fund holders. Mary built the public schools in the University of Oxford, but in the style more suited to her poverty than love of learning. They were afterwards taken down, and rebuilt, yet the university remembers her in the list of its benefactors. She likewise granted a mansion on Bennett's Hill, near St. Paul's, to the learned body of heralds, and it is to this day their college. However fatally mistaken either Mary or her ministers were in the principles of religious government, her last testament proves that she was not insensible to the prosperity of her country. The codicil of her will, added after her strange mania of maternity was dispelled by the near approach of death, provides for the amicable continuance of the alliance between England and Flanders, that great desideratum which had been a national object, since the alliance of William the Conqueror with Matilda of Flanders. Mary, in her codicil, thus solemnly addressed her husband and her successor. And for the ancient amity's sake, that hath always been between our noble progenitors, and between this my realm and the Low Countries, whereof his Majesty King Philip is now inheritor, as God shall reward him, I hope, among the elect servants of God, I pray that it may please his Majesty to show himself as a father in his care, or as a brother of this realm in his love and favor, and as a most assured and undoubted friend in his power and strength to my heir and successor. With this sentence concludes a biography which presented a task, at once the most difficult and dangerous that could fall to the lot of any Englishwoman to perform. It was difficult, because almost the whole of the rich mass of documents lately edited by our great historical antiquaries, Madden and Tytler, are in direct opposition to the popular ideas of the character of our first queen regnant, and dangerous, because the desire of recording truth may be mistaken for a wish to extenuate cruelty in religious and civil government. A narrative, composed of facts drawn from contemporaneous authorities, is here presented to the public, as little blended with comment as possible. Readers will draw their own inferences, and when their object is historical information, rather than controversy, these are really more valuable than the most elaborate essay that the pride of authorship can produce. If such inferences should induce an opinion that our first queen regnant mingled some of the virtues of her sex with those dark and stormy passions which have been attributed to her, there will but be fulfilled the motto which, in a mournfully prophetic spirit, she adopted for herself, that time unveils truth. End of Section 26. End of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 5, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland.